What's up, Trojan? So this is a video I've been wanting to make for a while, and I just want to really dispel a narrative that was getting thrown around during the 2023 season, that the 2023 season was the accurate representation of the Giants, and the 2022 season was a complete fluke. Team didn't deserve to make the playoffs. I don't know, some wild stuff was getting thrown around. And at the time, in 2023, the Giants were doing absolutely terrible. Looked like there was no hope for the season at all. Eventually, the Giants kind of turned around a little bit, got a few wins in, ended up competing late in the year, and capped it off by absolutely owning the Philadelphia Eagles. So, I feel like since those events took place, the narrative died down a bit, but I don't know, something about it just stuck with me. So, that's my thoughts on the 2023 season, why that was wrong right there. But back to the 2022 season, I feel like the 2022 team was a team that was well deserving of the playoffs and really got robbed of a few wins even. So I just want to take some time, go over this schedule here, the 2022 schedule, and just really recap this season. Because it was a big season for the Giants, actually winning a playoff game for the first time in what feels like forever, and just doing a lot. And it was the first year of the new regime, general manager Joe Shane coming in, head coach Brian Dable coming in, and, still had a lot of Gettleman guys on the roster. Obviously, they were able to bring in a few of their new guys, but it was a interesting mix, and they did go out of their way to retain a lot of the Gettleman guys, and it ultimately ended up being a lot of those Gettleman guys that did really well. So it made the coaching staff look amazing, and, the end result of that is Brian Dable winning Coach of the Year that year. So, just going to go through it quick, starting off with the Tennessee Titans. Now, this game was wild, because first half Giants did not look like anything. It looked like, yep, it's another one of those years. It's going to look like 2021, but with a few extra wins, and it's just not going to be nice. But then something happened in the second half, and, there was that one moment, Daniel Jones threw an interception in the red zone. He gets absolutely chewed out by Brian Dable, looks much better the rest of the game. And in the second half, a couple major things happened. There were huge plays by Sterling Shepard and Saquon Barkley. And that really set the team up for a huge win. And it ultimately ended up being Saquon Barkley that had the game-winning two-point conversion play. That was a wild turn of events. On the road in Tennessee, Giants just scored, down a point. You can kick the PAT, head it to overtime, see what happens, or you can go for two. If you hit two, you leave the other team with very few seconds left on the clock and desperately needing a field goal. And the Giants decided to go for two. Saquon got it in, and Giants start the season with a win. And the Giants hadn't had a winning record at any point in several years before that. Maybe not like several, but like it felt like a long time. Didn't have a winning record. Maybe literally since 2016. Because I can't remember a time in 2017, 18, 19, 20, or 21 where the Giants had a winning record. They always started by losing their first game. Never really made it up. I think the Giants may have had a tied record a couple times. 0-0, namely. But, yeah, so it was a huge win, started the year off right, and then just rolled right on next week. The Panthers, the way I remember this game, I don't remember much from the game, actually. I feel like nothing major happened. The Giants just kind of went in there, competed, and won. And I remember it being a fairly easy-looking win as well. I thought the Giants came out in the better team in that one. And then had the big Monday Night Football game against the Dallas Cowboys. And that one was a wild one. It ended up being a fairly close game. The Giants competed in it. And, this is going into my point. The Giants really competed against a lot of good teams in 2022. I'll get to some of the negatives that ended up happening later in the schedule. But, Dallas was a good team. And the Giants really competed against them, couldn't quite pull out the W, and also, unfortunately, Sterling Shepard got injured. And so that was very annoying. He ended up being out for the rest of that season, and, then he came back in 2023 and wasn't able to do too much, getting up there later in his career and everything. But I do remember those first two games in 2022. He looked really good, especially against the Titans. Then moved on to the Bears. Now this was an interesting game because the Giants pulled away fairly early, looked dominant the entire game, but it wasn't a high scoring game or anything. The offense wasn't the fastest. The defense really held together, and that's one thing I remember about 2022. Dexter Lawrence was dominant. Dexter Lawrence was always getting pressures and sacks and stuff and runs. He was great. And Kayvon Thibodeau was, still coming to his own, recapping his performance overall in 2022. He got a lot of pressures in there, made a lot of huge plays, but then you look back at the stats overall and you're like, four sacks? That doesn't sound... He had this major sack here, this major sack here, and it's like, oh, those are all his sacks. Okay. Meanwhile, 2023 season... He ended up with 11.5 sacks, I believe. And some of the only ones I remember are against the Jets. I don't want to say it, in a harmful way or hurtful way or anything, but he had a few meaningless sacks last season. Meanwhile, in 2022, 4.5 sacks. I feel like the team fell every single one of them. But yeah, Bears ended up being a fairly easy win, but the interesting thing was Daniel Jones got injured in that game, and Tyrod Taylor gets subbed in, also gets injured. So then Daniel Jones ends up coming back in after Saquon Barkley ends up taking snaps in the Wildcat, and the Giants ended up just running the ball to waste the clock and ended up milking the lead for what ended up being a solid win. Still. But then the Giants were in an interesting position, right? 3-1, going to London to face the Green Bay Packers, who, still a pretty decent team that year. They're definitely competing for the playoff spots and everything. I forget exactly how their season ended up, but they were no team to slouch at when it came down to it later in the season. The Giants ended up going in there and winning. It was a hard-fought, contested game, but the Giants ended up taking it, and one of the main plays I remember is a huge Dexter Lawrence sack. Packers very clearly in field goal range. Probably would have been, a low 50-yarder, maybe more like a 55-yard field goal. It's definitely field goal range in today's NFL. But Dexter Lawrence got a huge sack, knocked him right out of field goal range, forced him a punt. And, points coming off the board essentially like that are huge in the NFL and ended up really helping the Giants to a victory there. Then you have the Ravens game. And this was another game similar to the Titans game where the Giants didn't look that great in the first half, but ended up having a huge comeback in the second half and ended up being able to take that game. And one of the plays I really remember from that one is the Kayvon Thibodeau sack. He ended up strip sacking Lamar Jackson, and the main criticism is that he didn't recover the fumble. It was like, oh no, he couldn't recover the fumble. He strip sacked him and they lost yards on the play, but you gotta recover the fumble, even though the Giants won. It was a fun criticism. Because he didn't have, the best shot at recovering that fumble, if I remember correctly. But Giants ended up winning it, and now the Giants are looking really great on the schedule. Really great. And then you go to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and this is one of those games where I kind of I'm going to have to start going into the other part of the narrative, because on paper, with the Giants being well up in terms of record and everything, should look like an easy win for the Giants. One thing I do remember, though, is the Giants are actually considered the underdogs in that game, which made no sense to me. But the way the game played out ended up being a very close game. Ultimately, it was decided by a 1-yard difference in a stop, a tackle in which Xavier McKinney was on, a few other Giants, and ended up stopping a guy short of the goal line as the time ran out. But the Giants looked like the better team in my mind in that game all the way through, and especially that last possession. I mean, there was penalties being thrown around, some nonsense. I remember being very mad at the refs at the end of that game. And I feel like the Giants really should have been a team to win by more than a 1 yard tackle, or 1 yard difference in a tackle. But yeah, that's what I was getting into. There was a lot of games where the Giants looked dominant all throughout, and then just the score didn't really reflect that. I would argue the next game, the Seahawks. Giants ended up losing against the Seahawks here, but they looked like the better team in that game. You had the 2 fumbles by the punt returner at the time, Richie James. He was a solid wide receiver that year too, but those 2 punt return fumbles were not it. And, it was very unfortunate that ended up going down like that because it really did cost the Giants that game. Those were 2 huge turnovers, not helpful for momentum and not helpful for points either because it's on a punt. So basically, you just give up field goal position right away, and they definitely scored some points on that. But yeah, I think without those, the Giants could easily won that game. And then going into a bye week, very good record going into the bye week. Giants are looking great this season. The only interesting thing of note in that bye week was Saquon Barkley was offered a new contract with the Giants. He was able to re-sign. The report ended up being that was $12.5 million a year. No idea on the guaranteed money or anything. Contract length, I think, was like either 3 or 4 years. I mean, not much different than he ended up getting with the Eagles. He got $13 million there. I have no idea what the incentives are or anything, but, not much different. So, very interesting that a deal didn't get done there. But one thing that I noticed from that bye week is a lot of plays made from Saquon Barkley in the first half of that season. Before the bye week, I mean, he was being targeted in the passing game a lot more, and then after the bye week, he ended up only being used in the running game more. And those first games, Saquon Barkley looked elite. That first half of the season, he was elite. Every time he was running with the ball, a lot would happen. And then they also had him in the passing game, so he was able to do a lot there. He maximized all of his touches. He was much more of a downhill runner, but could still take a juke to the outside like he would in 2018. It was the perfect combo. And I feel like after that bye week, they ended up making him much more of just a downhill runner. I don't remember seeing as much of that jukiness or, that agility in the second half of the year. Kind of faded away. And he got used a lot less in the passing game, too. It was definitely a game plan change, and it was noticeable. And I just want to take the time there to comment on that because it was very obvious in the Texans game. The Texans game, I think Saquon Barkley ran like almost 40 times, if not 40, and only had like 120 yards or something. He didn't have a ton of yards for running that many times. And that was because he just ran up the middle over and over and over again for like 4 yards a run. But he was consistently getting like 4 yards, 4 yards a run. So they just kept doing it. And he didn't lose yards. He just, we only got 2 yards this time and they get 4 yards on the next one. Averaged out to about that. Giants ended up winning. And with that new game plan, I feel like that game was much closer than it could have been. I don't know. Something happened in the bye week. Be very curious to know what sort of game plan changes occurred there. And I feel like it's obvious based on the results, but be curious to know who said what, because things changed after that bye week. And then you walk into the Lions game. It's a very noticeable one. I didn't quite get the chance to watch that one, but the Giants lost, and it wasn't the closest game. I can't comment on the full reason why they lost, so I'm just going to have to skip that one. Then you go to Dallas. Again, Dallas, very solid team. And I do remember at this point in time, the Giants had a lot of injuries and still somehow managed to make a very close game on Thanksgiving. Thursday, so the shorter week too. Giants were able to turn around and have a solid performance. Didn't quite end up getting the win, but I do remember it being a real good game to watch. And the Giants competed, but they were much like the first Dallas game. They really competed, but Dallas did have a lead throughout. And then you start the Washington games, and this was a weird setup. So that first one that we're at now, that first Washington game, the Giants looked like the better team the entire game. The entire game, the Giants deserved to have a win there the way they looked. But weirdly, toward the end, overtime happened somehow. I thought the Giants had a very solid lead. Things were going great. The secondary kind of just collapsed, if I remember correctly. And it's overtime. Like, I don't know where that came from Washington. I don't know why the Giants defense left that up. I don't know why the offense stopped scoring points. I don't know why any of these things happened, but they did. We go to overtime, and then no one does anything in overtime. Defense, comes back, and the game just ends. It's a tie. It was a very weird ending to that one. But it did ultimately help the Giants secure a playoff spot, much more than a loss would have. So it kind of worked out, but it was a weird one. Then the Eagles. Giants had very bad luck against the Eagles this season. I have no idea what that was. Yeah, the Giants didn't look good against the Eagles. That is definitely one knock on the 2022 team all day. Did not look good against the Eagles and ultimately had a horrible division record because of it. Yeah, that's a very, very fair criticism. I can't say much about that. Then the Giants go to Washington. End up facing Washington again. And, it ended up being a Sunday night game. Big primetime slot. And this is one of those major sacks from Kayvon Thibodeau. Washington backed up near their own end zone. Kayvon Thibodeau has the huge sack, strip sack, turns around, recovers it, touchdown. Like, boom, stopped right in his tracks, right there. Kayvon Thibodeau won this game for the Giants. The offense didn't do a ton, but Kayvon Thibodeau was the guy. I felt like he stopped a ton of runs, too, in their tracks. Not like run stuffs as in, they only got a yard. Run stuffs as in the guy gets the ball and Kayvon Thibodeau tackles him and they lose 5 yards. There were run stuffs like that. He was batting balls. Kayvon was the guy in this game. It was a wild sight to see. And then, Giants are looking really high. And then they lose a close one against a really good team in the Vikings. I think that's a very fair synopsis of this game. Giants really competed in this one. Ultimately, the Vikings came out on top. It was a very close game, though. I think the difference was a long field goal, too, by the Vikings that ended up stealing it for them. A very close game. It's one of those games where, we all knew at the time as well, Vikings were probably going to the playoffs. Giants wanted to see the Vikings again, the playoffs. And so this next game was for the playoffs. Giants needed to win this one to feel good about anything in the playoffs. Giants come out against the Colts and absolutely dominate. And the main play I remember from this game, the Landon Collins pick six. It was reminiscent back to his Giants days, his prior Giants days when he was a safety. He was able to get a nice pick six. Not as good as the Rams one, but hey, you take pick sixes when you can get them. Was able to take a pick six right to the house, really sealed it, made the Giants look absolutely dominant in that game. And then the Giants sit their starters and lose to the Eagles, but even their backups, they had a very competitive game against the Eagles. And it's an interesting one to see. Because I think the Eagles kind of had something to play for, but not really. They weren't really enthusiastic about it, but they did have a motive to hold the first seed, I believe. Someone could have taken it if they won and the Eagles lost. I may be off on that, but I think the Eagles did play their starters, and the Giants' backups really took it to the Eagles' starters. So even the Giants' backups were looking good that year, but to be fair, the Giants' backups really were also their starters. Giants had a lot of injuries that season. I didn't want to take the time to go over all of them. The main ones were in the wide receiver core, which is why Daniel Jones got a lot of praise for that 2022 season, because he was thrown to some random guys. But those random guys ended up doing really well. Richie James mentioned before. Wan'Dale Robinson, when he was healthy, he ended up getting injured in that Lions game. Man. Oh, Isaiah Hodgins was the big one. That's the one I was trying to think of there. Isaiah Hodgins, this guy came out of nowhere, comes in after the bye week, and just became the number one wide receiver for the rest of the season. It was absolutely wild to see happen in real time. And then, Giants' record in the regular season ended up being 9-7-1. The losses, I felt like they were all close, or the Giants really dominated. And even though a lot of the wins looked really close, I feel like it was games where the Giants dominated and should have won by more, unless it was a really good team. Like, you can look at, if I remember correctly, the end score of, like, the Panthers and the Bears games, but the Giants looked like the better team all throughout. Same thing, biggest one is the Jacksonville game. The Giants looked like the better team all throughout, even though the score ended up looking really close. Giants really held leads in those games and did not give them up. And then, you're like, oh, they had a bunch of other close-scoring games, but it was against really good teams like the Titans, the Packers, the Ravens. The Texans would be more like the other point I had. Bad team, but Giants were clearly going to win that one and just kept a lead the whole time. Washington was a fairly good team, too, in that second one and the overtime win. Washington was a solid team. They were projected to win at least one of those against the Giants because of how good of a team they were. They actually, at one point, had better odds to make the playoffs than the Giants at that point in that season. So it was an interesting win, interesting competition there against Washington. So the Giants really were a dominant team. And then they ended up capping it off with that huge win against the Colts. I think that is a mark of a well-deserving playoff team. And then they go into the playoffs and they beat the Vikings. It was a solid game. I think the final score was 31-24. The Giants did look like the better team throughout that game. There were definitely a few moments where the Vikings scored and made it a very competitive game. But the Giants, at some point in there, pulled away and ended up securing that win. And then, the season ends by just getting wrecked by the Eagles. I have nothing to say to that. The Eagles clearly, when they wanted to beat the Giants, they were able to beat the Giants by a lot. I don't know what they had on the Giants. I don't know what they found schematically. I don't know what went into the hearts of the Giants players going up against the Eagles. Something happened there because the team and everything I was describing this entire time did not look like a team that would just face even a really good team like the Eagles that season and just lose. And the Eagles did end up making the Super Bowl that year and losing it, but you'd think the Giants could have done better than losing. I think both games had similar scores. That first Eagles game in season I mentioned and that playoff game both ended like 34-10 basically, or 35-10. It was something like that. Not fun games to watch either. But overall, I thought there was a lot to take away from that 2022 season. I thought more of that would carry over in the 2023 season. But in my mind, 2023 is the anomaly, and 2022 is the model to replicate, especially that first half of the season. Giants did a lot more in the passing game that first half of the season. I feel like the second half, they did consciously try to have something more going on in the run game, and I think those last two games for the bye week are really, if there was something, like I said, like Brian Dable walking in or Mike Kafka walking into a room and going, we need to just run the ball down the middle with Saquon Barkley so much more, and Daniel Jones needs to play completely differently, and we got to rework this. I think that would have been because that Jacksonville game was too close in their eyes, which, it did end up being too close, but still won it. And then that Seahawks game where it's like, all right, we need to have a game plan that doesn't allow for some turnovers to happen. I don't know. Those are my thoughts on the 2022 Giants, and ultimately, I think the 2022 Giants are going to be more representative of the team next season. Now, if the Giants go out in the draft and get a quarterback, anything is on the table. But if they do go into the season with Daniel Jones, is not favorable as that seems, considering he didn't play well in 2023. I think he would get closer to the 2022 form, maybe more like when the Giants were 4-7 in 2021. Daniel Jones wasn't really the reason the Giants were losing games when they were 4-7 in 2021. I mean, he wasn't helping. He had his turnovers. He had his several issues, but, he wasn't the main culprit. But a few times in 2023, he looked like the main culprit. He couldn't do anything at times, especially that Raiders game in which he did ultimately end up getting injured. He came back and was not looking good. That was a 2023 one, though. Yeah, so hopefully, if the Giants do go with Daniel Jones, he's able to come back, look much more like he did in 2022. But if the Giants do go out and get another quarterback, it's completely understandable because he didn't look good at all in 2023. Giants don't have Saquon Barkley now, but the way they were using Saquon Barkley in the second half of 2022, you can sub in any running back in that type of system. All they really asked him to do was run up the middle for 4 yards. A decent offensive line can make any NFL running back do that. And then going to the wide receivers, if you are going to go with Daniel Jones, get a wide receiver in the draft. There's a couple right there. My favorite right now is Neighbors. Very apt comparisons to Odell Beckham Jr., in my opinion. I mean, they went to the same college. That's a good option. That would help the offense out a lot, I think. And going to the defense, we're going to a completely different scheme now. But Kayvon Thibodeau looking really good. Adding Brian Burns and still having a prime Dexter Lawrence. That's a fierce defensive line. Figure out some things in the secondary. But the Giants do have at least one solid corner now in Deonte Banks, in my opinion. I think he's a really great corner. Definitely comparisons to a well-playing Adoree Jackson and James Bradbury in 2022. See how it plays out. No, not 2022. Yeah, James Bradbury wasn't on the team in 2022. That's my bad there. It was Adoree Jackson. Yeah, Adoree Jackson was the number one corner in 2022. He looked really good. I think apt comparisons between him, Deonte Banks there. Yeah, and just a few things to figure out with a new safety, of course, because Xavier McKinney was also very prominent in the defense in 2022. But last season, Bobby Okereke was introduced to the team, looked really good on defense. So the defense should come out looking fine next season. The offense can just figure some things out. Giants can get a good few wins. See how it plays out. See you guys in the next one.